Thank you, John said to Graymond. It was nice to see all of you. I'll try my best to make sure that he doesn't get enough power to kill anybody else. Graymond said one last thing before John climbed back out of the entryway to the refuge. I know you can do it. John stepped foot back into the refreshing night air, spotting his hover wagon sat down against the side of the refuge. How did the puppeteer affect the world that he lived in when he was in another dimension? He lifted the side, then pressed the small button again. The hover wagon adjusted to the weight placed on it and then stayed in one spot in the air. John gently grasped the rope loop and continued to close the door to the refuge, closing off all of the homely light that had come from the candles inside. He stepped across the pine needles that were turning orange from age as he walked back, and he headed in the direction he remembered the road was. He came back to the road, staying down and out of sight from anybody that could still be guarding it. There was nobody in sight, and he thought that he might actually make it to Blood Lake undiscovered. John continued forward, not seeing anything else but trees. There was another bend in the road after he walked for about 10 minutes, and there were some old houses that were at the end of the road. He didn't want to check them. They looked long abandoned and were most definitely uninhabited. He crossed the road and continued down to the main road to Blood Lake. The road curved left, so he followed it until he came into some sort of pay to enter. It had looked overgrown, but the light was still on. There was a figure that sat inside. John ducked out of ways as to not get seen by it. He was unsuccessful. The figure turned to him, and John didn't even notice as its swift movement. John didn't even notice its swift movement. John didn't even notice its swift movement as it turned to look at him so fast. Okay, yeah, it needed the word as. It turned to look at him so fast. John had known it saw him, so he took off. The figure was slightly inhuman, bearing multiple scars that hadn't left the typical lighter skin tone, but instead grown into lumps. What am I even reading? I'm reading non-existent words. It seemed to be a woman, but the proportions were off. Her eyes were misplaced and her nose was lopsided. I'm not even gonna try to read that actually. It's but what it says is like you and then like a crack in the middle and then need, but there's like another crack and it's like static, but it says you need to pay. It it said not only seeming like a stutter, but a glitch. The closest thing that John could get out of the mechanical like voice was that he needed to pay to get in, but mechanic the inhuman computer buzzing crackle it made scared John off. He ran into the forest so fast that he almost left his hover wagon behind him, but the hover wagon had crucial supplies, so he quickly bent down to pick it up. John stopped running when he lost his stamina, and when he looked behind himself to see if anything was coming, he felt himself enter some sort of field in the air when a sense of dread washed over him so hard that he regretted going inside instantly. It almost felt like he went back in time a couple of days, which he had never experienced, but just felt the jolt to somewhere a few days back. He needed to keep his self-made promise, though. John knew he was in Blood Lake now. There was a break in the trees, and he could see some black pavement in the moonlight. Dawn was beginning to break in the sky, leaving it a very dark gray. It seemed unwelcoming, but he persisted. John followed the road until he came back upon the blacksmith. It had been a parking lot. It had 3 rows of 10 that were split in the middle to let cars drive through, so that it made 6 rows of 5. John knew he was safe now, so he stepped back onto the dirt road and continued until he stepped onto the pavement. The hover wagon still followed John as he stepped past the curb of the parking lot and into the forest that was just beyond it. He instantly felt a presence. He tried to look like he was ignoring it, but John could tell that it knew. There was a strange quality to the airflow that John had never sensed before, as snow started to gently sprinkle the earth around him. It hadn't snowed in West Virginia since 2019, but this place was a government watch site for a reason. Dawn had advanced into a cold white color, but the temperatures still seemed fine. John didn't know where to start advancing to meet up with the puppeteer, and he didn't even know how, but he guessed he would figure out. There was a slow shuffle coming from the woods, and John looked up to see what it could have been. The shuffling continued but was out of sight. John could hear it, but couldn't tell what direction it came from. It sped up. John could not stay there. He left what he had set on the ground, which was only a mat he could sit on and admire the purplish wood. He grabbed the handle on his hover wagon and took off, mentally crossing his fingers that the securement he'd put in place for all of his items was good enough. Luckily, the hover plate was good enough at advancing to high speeds at random times. John ran as the shuffling got closer and closer to him. He didn't want to look back, since when he did, he would lose a little bit of speed. The forest was also very populated as well, so he would crash into a tree without a doubt. So John kept running until his stamina couldn't take it anymore. He wanted to look at what he had heard, but he didn't want it to catch him. The snow level on the ground had increased to about a centimeter, but for some reason John didn't feel cold at all. He didn't leave any footprints either. It almost felt like the snow was a hologram. But when he reached down to touch the snow with the bare skin on his hand, the normal temperature of the snow returned, even though his hand passed right through it. He had exited the forest and came into an area that he could clearly see the lake. Just as Grayman had said, it was deep purplish maroon color and a disgusting consistency of clumps of blood and stringy, syrupy like yellow oil that floated on top. It had seemed like it had risen, even though he didn't even know its original height. Garrett had been wrong about this place. The pictures of the lake were bright blue, and John had wondered why it had been called that before it had turned red. But there was already a task at hand. But John needed to escape whatever this thing was and go somewhere safer. There was something up on the mountain that was just across the lake. It looked to be a small cabin-like structure, but the mountain was pretty big for a cabin, so by the way it looked, it seemed to look like if they took all of the levels of a superstructure and lined them up next to each other. This thing was gigantic. There were chimneys coming out of the top that must have been the height of small skyscrapers. He entered the forest again so he could try to lose the thing faster. John heard the slow shuffling coming from the trees behind him, so he kept on the move and headed toward the building. He continued so as not to let whatever the thing was see him, but something told him that he was already caught, so he swerved through the forest to try to lose whatever it was. But it could tell he was going to the structure, so it swerved out of the way and headed toward the building as John stayed in the forest. He peered through the trees and saw the lake again, beginning to light up with the rising sun. John got a look at what he thought the slow shuffling was coming from. It seemed like a long dead, hideous attempt at a human reconstruction. Instead of the top part being human, the upper half was from a horse. John didn't even know that its destination was the building and not him, but all he figured was that it was going there before him. John stumbled into a strange emptiness in the forest. A circular patch of trees that had seemed to not go farther than a specific centimeter lay dead at center in John's path to the building. There had been a small red square in the middle. Although the colors were slightly faded, as John got close to the square, he could see that the colors were printed on some sort of metal and had cracked with age. There were 3 holes at the bottom of the picture that seemed like something needed to go there in order to unlock something. Inside the holes were strange metallic needle-like rods that had stuck out. John could see them bounce slightly with the slight shaking of the ground when he stepped with his steel-toed boots. The design of the square had a large eye covering most of the surface with some black letters that seemed to slightly drip downwards. The square read "Always Watching."